Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video, I'll be talking about the history of the winner's edit in Survivor, which is obviously the idea that the editors edit the winners in a specific way, and that this trend can be used to assess who is going to win a season from pretty early on. Obviously, this concept is expanded through Edgic, which I might talk about in greater detail later, but for this video, we'll talk specifically about the winner's edit. And to do that, I'll be going through every single winner up to this point in Survivor history and talk about how their edit connects to this concept as a whole. Now, a traditional winner's edit doesn't really appear in every season, and it does vary from season to season, but there are trends that they typically follow, like being important to the season's themes, having strong personal content in the premiere, blatant display of their relationships within the game, pivotal content during important episodes like the premiere, swap, and merge episodes. But again, this doesn't always happen. There isn't a 100% set rule for this. But let's just jump into it. Let's talk about the edits of all these winners and the evolution of the winner's edit over time, starting off with Richard Hatch. So Hatch got an edit that isn't really looked at as your typical winner's edit nowadays. Again, I don't feel like the earlier seasons really follow the rules that we kind of look at now. And Borneo itself is just such an outlier from every other season the way that it was edited. But I do find it very fascinating that despite being the first winner of the show, Hatch was shown in a pretty negative light. Now, not that bad in terms of modern standards, but was shown to be overconfident, and he rubbed people the wrong way, no pun intended. But he did get the most content the entire way through, including some pretty positive content early on. From the merge on, his edit was largely negative, and I think a lot of that has to do with this being before production was trying to tell a season-long narrative. I feel like they were more so just trying to show what actually happened. But there are some winner edit tropes that can be seen here. I mean, obviously, Rich's relationship with Rudy was a prominent relationship on the show. Rich's strategic acumen being on full display is another thing that we commonly see from winners nowadays. And obviously, his iconic winner quote at the very beginning of the first episode, where he says, "I've got the $1 million check written already. I mean, I'm the winner." I mean, again, that's such a blatant piece of foreshadowing that does become prominent in later winner edits moving on. But outside of those things, his edit doesn't really follow what you would expect from a winner's edit. And now let's move on to Tina, who for the most part did get a really positive edit. While she wasn't the main hero of the season, which in my opinion was meant to be Colby, Tina's edit was more in line with a typical winner's edit, with constant positive content, a focus on her relationship with Colby, and a big edit in pivotal episodes like the Mitchell boot and the merge episode. But something interesting that I did find with Tina was that she's one of the few players to not be featured in the premiere. It was only her and Kel who got pretty much no content in that opening episode, and as I mentioned before, the premiere is an important episode for the winner's edit, typically. But I feel like for the premiere here, Tina was more intentionally hidden at the beginning of the show to throw off the scent of her win. So that's something interesting that might be brought up later. Ethan's edit was another really positive one, and like Tina, I don't see him as the main character of the season, probably the second or third most important character, which again is another kind of trend with these winner edits. He constantly got positive content, he had a great premiere, had strong personal content throughout the season, had a great swap episode where he orchestrates the Silas boot. He does have a very quiet merge episode, but outside of that, I do feel like Ethan's edit is more in line with your typical winner edit. Now for Vesepia, who out of the winners so far, she definitely had the quietest edit, and this would be a trend for some of the under-the-radar female winners that we'll see later on. But if I'm being honest here, I feel like for Vesepia in particular, I feel like it was more so because production just didn't like her. It didn't find her interesting. They found her pretty boring. I feel like that's the reason why she gets an under-the-radar edit. I mean, she does get some good content in her original tribe, with her relationship with Sean being a major one within the season, but she's barely shown on the show after the swap, pretty much up until the end game, with Sean getting a lot of the content for the duo. So overall, she doesn't really get that memorable of an edit on the season, but I do think she's the first of these under-the-radar female winners, and does set a trend for the editing style of those type of winners. But now moving on to Brian, who very clearly gets a negative edit on this season, but the negativity doesn't really come until the back half of the season. He has a relatively quiet edit for a dominant winner during that first half of the season, where he does get a few moments of positivity during those first few episodes, and his edit could have been more negative overall if the rumors about what Brian was doing out there are true. So it does seem like he was a bit sheltered from the edit, but overall he was still portrayed as a villainous winner, even more so than Rich, and probably even more so than any other winner in the history of Survivor, where he was just portrayed as being so cold-blooded and so calculated with everything that he would do. And this isn't really the type of edit that we would typically see. Though I do think there are some similarities between Brian's edit here and Sarah's edit in Game Changers, though there are some major differences, and we might talk about those later. Now moving on to Jenna, who also got a really strange edit, another mostly negative edit, but this time for a female winner. And most of her negativity came from comments she would make along with Heidi about being cute, attractive girls, and also them shunning Christy, and she also threatens to quit at one point in the game when she's not on the outs. Again, this wasn't a great look. And from a pure Edgic perspective, I don't get how you would have guessed that she was going to be the winner of the season with the type of edit that she got. But she did have a lot of strong personal relationships being showcased, with obviously the Heidi one being the strongest one, and she wasn't portrayed negatively the entire way through, but it does feel like the edit kind of buried her, even though she did end up winning the season, and with it being clear that a lot of the jury did actually like her. Now for Sandra in Pearl Islands, who to me had a really strange edit as well. I think this mostly comes from her being portrayed in a mostly positive light, despite her doing things that wouldn't make you think that she's supposed to be portrayed positively. She does get into constant arguments, though to be fair, most of them were with Fair Play, who undeniably was the villain of the season. Her dumping fish and then throwing Krista under the bus for it, obviously that's something that isn't great. Her being the one to not believe the grandma lie, which again, the show portrayed as truth at the time, only to reveal that it was fake later. But I do think these things are moments that should have been portrayed negatively for her. But I think at the end of the day, all these are big moments for the show and things that you just couldn't not put on. Obviously, her strong relationships with people like Rupert and Krista were showcased on the season. She had a great premiere where she leads her tribe through the bargaining in the village. But I do think she's one of the few people that could have won by the time of the end game edgically. I mean, she's one of the few that didn't get such a either quiet or negative edit or inconsistent edit to where they couldn't win. So her winning at the end of the game isn't that surprising. Now for Amber, who from an editing perspective, she was just shown to be Boston Rob's sidekick. I mean, she was shown more positively compared to Boston Rob, who had a negative edit the entire way through. Amber's edit does follow that Vesepia mold where she was part of a duo and the other member of that duo got most of the screen time, where she is one of the least prominent characters up until the swap, where she does have a massive episode there, but then after that she does remain pretty quiet for the rest of the way. Again, Amber for me just follows the similar trend that you would expect from an under-the-radar female winner. Now moving on to Chris Doherty, who had a very different style of editing for the time. He had a very big premiere where he does become the initial target due to him falling off the balance beam, but he was eventually able to form the majority and pretty much run the game in the pre-merge. However, something I do find interesting though is that this was a negative premiere for him. I mean, he did get a lot of negative content from other people, and I do think that is an interesting start for his season. And the fact that he is relatively quiet until the merge is another thing that is pretty interesting for this edit. But once he gets to the merge, actually really the penultimate episode before the merge, his edit really shoots up, where he does become the decision maker for the Guys Alliance in that episode. And once that alliance starts to fall apart, he's shown just scraping by until the final 7, where from the final 7 on, he gets one of the biggest edits in the history of the show, where he goes from having only 27 confessionals coming into episode 11 to having the most by the end of the season at 75. It's a ridiculous run, both gameplay-wise and edgically, and a radically different winner's edit to the others that we've seen up to this point. And while this mold of having a solid premiere, then remaining relatively quiet until the merge, and then having their edit really pick up from there, is kind of a typical thing you'll see in modern winner edits, I do feel like at the time, Chris's run here was pretty unprecedented. But then we move on to Tom, who I think is the first person who gets your typical winner edit. He gets positive content throughout the season, never really being the main character until the mid-game, and specifically until after Stephanie goes home. His edit really shoots up after that. And while he does get minor negative content here and there, I don't see how you can watch this season and not think that Tom is going to win. Especially after Ian's edit starts to go downhill, I think it was very clear that Tom was going to be the winner. And whenever I think of an early winner's edit, I feel like Tom is the first example that comes to my mind. Now moving on to Danny, and Danny does follow the under-the-radar female winner sort of trope of barely being shown in the pre-merge, but strangely, she doesn't get a season-long, strong relationship that Vesepia and Amber had, and mind you, a lot of the reason for that is because she couldn't. I mean, all of her allies were taken out. But I feel like something that does make her edit a bit strange here is that Danny herself supposedly didn't reveal her game during confessionals and feared that production would be leaking something to other players. But by the time of the end game, she does get some more positive content. Her relationship with Rafe does become a major storyline in that end game, and she does have a really strong final 6 episode. But I do feel like her win could still come as a surprise due to her lack of importance in the season as a whole. But again, that's potentially her own fault for not revealing her strategy. So as a whole, I do feel like Danny's edit is kind of an outlier just due to a lot of just weird circumstances around it. Now for Aris, who from what I understand was the frontrunner edgically the entire way through. And for me, his edit doesn't really stand out to me. I mean, he does get some negative content early on, and even during the early merge. However, he does get some positive content here and there, and there was really nothing to really eliminate his chances, while almost everyone else on the season clearly didn't have a chance of winning. So I feel like he's more of an example of having the best edit of the bunch, despite him not having a perfect edit in his own right. Like, everyone else had massive flaws in their edit, while his were only minor. So I feel like because of that, he kind of comes out as the frontrunner there. Now for Yule, and I feel like Yule is someone that gets a pretty standard winner edit. And he starts off with pretty strong personal content with him talking about his heritage, him getting the bulk of the strategic credit for the entire season, especially at the merge episode. And he was prominent on the season, but not a massive figure like someone like a Penner. And while he does end up getting some negativity late into the game, that is another thing that, again, winner edits sometimes do, is have the winner get some negative content in the last couple episodes of the season to kind of throw off the scent of a winner edit. So again, for Yule, pretty typical winner edit here. Pretty predictable that he was going to win. Now for Earl, who had the most obvious winner edit up to this point in Survivor history, in my opinion. Again, he gets the most consistent presence on the season the entire way through, gets consistent positive content, gets consistent strategic content. His relationship with Yao was one of the most prominent storylines on the season. And he gets one of the most obvious winner quotes where he declares himself the king of Fiji. I mean, there's really no doubt that Earl was going to win this season from pretty early on. Now let's move on to Todd, whose edit harkens back to that of Richard Hatch or Brian Heidick, where he does start off pretty toneless. I mean, he does look like a top contender with a good amount of strategic content, and also his relationships with Aaron, Amanda, and James being a prominent storyline on the season. But around the merge, his content gets really negative. But I feel like none of that content's really enough to fully eliminate his winner chances. And while I do think Amanda had more of a winner's edit coming into that finale, as I feel like her edit wasn't too dissimilar from that of like an Amber's, I didn't feel like it was completely out of left field that someone like a Todd would win this season. Now for Parvati, who I think got a pretty clear winner's edit in line with some of the other female winners up to this point. I mean, she starts off with a strong first episode, which sets up her redemption arc. She has strong relationships with Amanda, James, Ozzy, and Sri that are showcased. But after those first few episodes, she does remain a bit quiet for a little while. Until like the end of the post-swap, where she does pick up Natalie and Alexis, builds the Black Widow Brigade, which get a lot of strategic credit there. Prominent figure in almost every episode from that point on. And while she does get, again, negative content, this is another situation where I feel like while her edit was flawed, it was just better than everyone else's. So I feel like just based on the edit, it was clear that Parvati was going to win this season. Now for Bob, and Bob straight up has one of the weirdest winner edits in history of the show. I mean, he gets positive content throughout the season, but his content never has any real depth to it. I mean, while he does get a decent first episode, he quickly becomes a background character up until the merge. And while he does get a good chunk of content during the Randy and Corinne boots, he never really comes out as a front runner and was never really expected to win this season. And his edit was just really abnormal for a male winner of the show. Usually by the end of the season for a male winner, they are a pretty dominant figure on the show, like usually one of the top few confessional getters. But for Bob, he never really became that. So I do think having a crazy winner edit for Bob in a crazy season that is Gabon, I think it is pretty fitting. Now for JT, who you would think would be the Edgic frontrunner for most of the season, but from what I understand, Steven was actually the frontrunner for the entire season. Not to say that JT's edit was bad, as JT was the top contender as well. I mean, he was the number 2 contender for most of that season, and he does get a positive edit the entire way through, without being a major character until the end of the pre-merge. And from there, his edit really kicks up a notch, where he gets a ridiculous amount of positive content from Brendan and Coach. And while I do think Steven does get more of the strategic credit for the pair, it is clear that JT was supposed to be the rooting interest for the audience. So again, it was pretty clear that one of those two were going to win, and the fact that JT does come out on top isn't that surprising. Now for Natalie White, who everyone knows got a really strange winner edit. I mean, she didn't get a confessional until episode 4, which is really insane. And her only content before that was Russell recruiting her for the Dumbass Girls Alliance. I mean, she does have a very strong merge episode, and her bonds with the Galoos are shown at points, but she was never really looked at as a frontrunner. Again, this is another season where, like, Mick, of all people, was looked at as the Edgic frontrunner the entire way through, with Russell in the second spot for most of the season as well. But what the edit did make pretty clear here was that a FOA member was going to win, as the Galoo tribe was just extremely underdeveloped. And in retrospect, it is pretty clear that this season was edited not to show why Natalie won, but instead to show why Russell lost. And this is a style of editing you could see with like Amber's win against Boston Rob, and even Danny's win against Stephanie. Now for Sandra from Heroes vs. Villains, where Sandra could be looked at as another why Parvati and Russell lost over why Sandra won story. I feel like there was a lot more in the edit showing why she won than those other edits. She was another one pegged as a winner candidate from very early on, and by the time the merge, she was the very clear frontrunner edgically, with her being the direct opposition to Russell, who was obviously not winning the game based off the edit. So she kind of fits into that under-the-radar female winner role of having a slower start, but consistent foreshadowing and positive content leading to her win at the end. Now for Fabio, who had some really strange elements to his edit, like his just overall doofiness and over-the-top nature, but I think that's just who Fabio is. So that kind of needed to be there. I mean, he does get constant content throughout the entire season, but is, again, never looked at as the main character. He has a really obvious winner quote where he says, "I don't care what they call me, I'm going to win the $1 million." Again, very blatant foreshadowing, and he's another one that by the time the end game, it's really clear by the edit that he's the front runner, as he's the least flawed out of the remaining players. So again, seeing him win at the very end, not too surprising. Now for Boston Rob, who I think you would think would be the front runner edgically the entire way through, but from what I understand, during the pre-merge, Andrea was actually looked at as the front runner ahead of him. Now, despite him having a pretty quiet premiere, he does get a lot of positive content from the other players, and from that point on, he dominates the screen time for the rest of the season. But I feel like that's a major reason why he wasn't looked at as a front runner, because he was overexposed to the point that very few winners before him had been. And that's another element of the winner's edit, is that usually the winner doesn't get overexposed. Usually there's never a massive string of points, especially earlier on in the season, where the winner is prevalent the entire way through. Usually there's a cooldown period, and that's something that Boston Rob never got. And I feel like that's a major reason why Boston Rob wasn't looked at as a front runner until the point at the end of the game where it's like, there's no way that anyone else can win. Again, by the time we got to the merge, it was pretty clear he was just going to run the table. And with his redemption arc that was set up, and then also his personal content with him talking about Amber, and with him obviously, again, dominating the game, like, there was just no doubt that he was going to win this season. Now for Sophie, whose edit did kind of follow the under-the-radar female edit, though I do feel like she was featured a bit more than a lot of those other winners. I mean, she was someone that was constantly in almost every episode, but was just never the focus of any episode. I mean, I do think this season clearly was edited as another like why Coach lost season over a why Sophie won. But she did get constant content and was looked at as a top contender by the time of the merge, though again was never in that number one position. Now for Kim, and Kim has probably the most obvious winner edit ever. I mean, she is someone that gets constant content in the pre-merge without becoming too prominent. Her edit kicks off at the merge, where she gets strategic credit for pretty much everything. I mean, she gets a lot of complex content in almost every episode. She gets personal content. Her relationships are focused on the entire way through. Again, it's just super clear that she's going to win from the very beginning. There was really never any doubt. Now for Denise, and I find Denise's edit kind of weird because I do feel like it's the opposite of a standard winner's edit, where a standard winner's edit has a bit of a slower pre-merge, but they become very prominent in the end game. I feel like Denise was the very opposite. I feel like Denise got so much content earlier on in the game due to her being on the Matt Singh tribe and her relationship with Malcolm, but by the time of the merge, she becomes a background character. And it's only during the Abby drama that she's really a prominent figure in this end game. And because of this, Denise was a major frontrunner during the beginning of the season, but she drops off on the contenders list during the post-merge until the penultimate episode, where it does become clear that Malcolm is being set up to be taken out fourth. So edgically, Denise would be the most likely winner at that point, but again, this is a bit of an abnormal edit in my opinion. Now for Cochran, who gets another one of the most obvious winner edits ever. A strong highlighted relationship with Dawn, strong personal content, a redemption arc, strong strategic content, consistent content without being a major character until the post-merge, where his edit skyrockets, and he really has no competition from that point on. I mean, it's just so clear that he's the winner of the season. Let's just move on. So now for Tyson, who had a bit of a strange edit where he starts off very quiet. I mean, he doesn't get that much content to premiere. He gets the least amount of content into premiere. But he does get good content after Rachel boot, where he gets a lot of positive content coming from his confessional, where he says he needs to win to avenge her. And we also get positive content from him after he injures his shoulder. But Monica was actually the frontrunner edgically throughout the first half of the season. But come the merge, again, Tyson's edit kicks off, where he becomes the central figure of the season, and despite his content being negative for a good chunk of the season, his edit did follow a similar trajectory as that of like a Brian or a Parvati. So despite the negativity, it was clear he was more than likely the winner. Alright, now for Tony. Tony is one of the most surprising winners from an Edgic perspective ever. I mean, Tony was the focal point of that season from the very beginning. And again, that sort of player doesn't typically win, especially so when that's paired with a mostly negative edit. I mean, I remember during this season, people were saying, oh my God, LJ's going to win. LJ's the obvious winner. And when LJ went home, a lot of people were just scrambling. And then it went from LJ to Trish, and then Trish to Spencer. Like, people were just throwing everyone's names around of who's going to win except for Tony. Like, coming into the finale, Tony was literally ranked 4 out of 4 edgically, even behind Cass. I mean, Tony is such an enigma from an editing standpoint. I think that's what made his win so fascinating to watch. Now for Natalie Anderson, who is someone that for the most part follows your typical female winner edit, where she is relatively quiet early on. She does get some negative content during the John Rocker boot episode. But again, I mean, she does have her relationship with Jeremy. She does get a storyline of her wanting to get revenge for Nadia. And she does get strong strategic content, like when she bonds with Baylor. But she is quiet at the merge, and it's not until the Jeremy boot where her edit really picks up. It's kind of similar to that of like an Amber or of a Sepia, where she was part of this duo with Jeremy. Jeremy was getting all the screen time, but unlike those other two, Jeremy gets picked off relatively early on. And when Jeremy gets picked off, her edit skyrockets and becomes the typical winner edit at that point. I mean, she becomes the star of the show, getting strategic credit for pretty much everything. She has the storyline of getting revenge for Jeremy as well at that point. And everyone else's edit was just really messy. So it was very clear during these last few episodes that she was the front runner. Now for Mike, who was a pretty obvious winner as well. I'm from pretty early on. He gets consistent content the entire way through. And while it does range between positive and negative, he was a clear frontrunner along with Jen by the time of the merge. From the merge on, it was so clear that he was winning the game, even with his position of needing to win out. The edit just made it really clear that he was going to do so, especially considering all of the other endgamers in that season had very flawed edits on their own right. So again, for me, Mike's edit was very obvious. Now for Jeremy, who again clearly gets a typical winner's edit. He was consistently on the season, getting at least one confessional in every episode. He was consistently getting complex content. His relationships with Savage, Steven, and Spencer were showcased. He had personal content in his constant talking about Val. But with that being said, his edit never skyrockets like it does for many other edits like this. There are a couple episodes in the post-merge where he does get a fair share of screen time, but he's never the main character of an episode. But he was shielded by the Stephen boot, which again is something that typically happens when a winner is out of the loop. They're usually not really displayed in that episode that they are out of the loop to portray them in obviously a more positive light. So despite not being prevalent in the edit as much as most other male winners, it was pretty clear he was going to win the game due to just the sheer consistency of his edit. Now for Michelle, who once again got a really obvious winner's edit. I mean, this was a major contention point for the Edgic community at that time, where edgically it was very clear that Michelle was going to win, but so many people were rooting for Aubrey, and Aubrey was being displayed as playing the better game. So there was a lot of Michelle truthers versus a lot of Aubrey fans at that point, and even after the season, obviously. But again, obviously, it was clear that Michelle was winning the game. She got a solid premiere where we learn about her background. We see her build an alliance with the women, which we learn after the season that actually didn't occur until later into the game. She was just someone that kept on getting content where there was no reason for her to be getting any. She never went to tribal until the merge and had little to do with any decision making within her alliances, but for some reason she was just consistently being shown, especially after the swap. And from that point on, we do get a good look into her perspective on the game and the people around her, despite her not really doing anything. Which was a clear indicator that she was going to win the game. But again, I should mention that this is when the concept of edgic started to become a lot more talked about. And through that, production started to change the way they edited certain winners. And we'll be talking about that starting with Adam, who had a very abnormal winner's edit. He started off pretty solid. He started off never being the top contender, but he was always consistently in the running with, again, constant, complex content, and most of that being positive. But the thing that knocked Adam out of contention for a while was his massive streak of negative content around the time of the merge. He got a lot of negativity on the show from his relationship with Taylor, and this was looked at as a nail in his coffin in his edit. While people like David, Ken, and Jay, and even Hannah were looked at as more likely winners than him, mostly due to this. And in a standard season before this, it would have been. But coming in right after Michelle's win, I feel like the editors wanted to shake things up, and they do continue to do this for a couple of the later winners. But Adam was the first example of this, of them doing something that would be detrimental to your edit on any other season, but in this season it seemed like they actually tried to surprise some people. Now moving on to Sarah, and I mentioned that her edit was very similar to a Brian Heidick's, and it kind of is the female version of Heidick's edit. It is a bit more of a traditional winner edit where she is pretty quiet during the first half of the season, but does get a very solid first couple episodes where she introduces her arc of playing like a criminal, and then she stays pretty quiet up until the Varner stuff where she gets a lot of positive content in that episode. And then from the Debbie boot on, she is the strategic center of the game, getting constant strategic content and really just being shown to be pretty ruthless. And while Brad was still a contender coming into the finale, it was pretty clear that Sarah was getting the more traditional winner edit. But that being said, I do feel like Brian, I feel like they did cut a lot of her negative content out as well. There's a lot more cutthroat gameplay from Sarah that we've learned about after the season that wasn't shown on the show. I feel like that was probably done to make her a bit more likable to the audience. Alright, now for Ben, who goes back to having a strange edit just like Adam's. He starts off with a really strong edit, very clear frontrunner coming into the merge, but just like Adam, he has a bevy of negative content at the merge. A lot of it coming from him being the one in control and him dominating the airtime during this section of the season, way too much for a traditional winner edit. So it was during this time that people like Lauren and Devin shot up in winner contention while Ben significantly dropped. But again, Ben's run at the end was kind of predictable. It kind of became like a Mike situation where you kind of just knew he was going to end up doing it. And also with the knowledge that the winner's edit has slightly changed in recent seasons, I do think Ben was pretty clearly a frontrunner even coming into this finale. Now moving on to Wendell, whose edit starts off pretty similar to a traditional one, but the difference here is that his edit never really picks up to the extent that we normally see. He gets a solid pre-merge with a great premiere that gives him personal content and also showcases his relationship with Dominic. But then he stays relatively quiet until the merge. But at the merge, his edit just goes all over the place, where he shifts from positive to negative content on and off, and Dominic is shown as being the strategic core of that duo. So because of that, Dominic does become the front runner for the rest of the season, especially as he's being shown doing, again, most of the work for that duo. But it is pretty clear that either Dominic or Wendell are going to win. It just wasn't 100% clear which one it was. And while Dominic was the front runner, Wendell wasn't too far behind him. So again, Wendell's win wasn't that unexpected, though it was slightly quieter than what you would expect from a male winner of the show. Now moving on to Nick, and I feel like Nick gets your typical winner's edit outside of the premiere. And I think that threw a lot of people off at the time, as he gets a pretty negative premiere. He's one of the last people to get personal content in that episode. He's someone that was called out for being lazy, but everything after that premiere was so clearly leading to his win, including him being shielded during the Carl boot, where he was clearly out of the loop. Again, he does get a negative penultimate episode, but again, that's kind of a typical winner thing at this point. So while people did have doubts about Nick winning the game, I personally never did. I thought it was pretty clear he was winning. Now for Chris, and I mean, come on. Chris is obviously a massive outlier. I mean, like Tina, he got no content in that premiere. And again, this is them kind of hiding the winner in plain sight. I think what they were trying to do here is make this season really unpredictable. I mean, the producers themselves have said that they wanted to edit this season like a murder mystery. So, I mean, they did that. I mean, Chris had a near invisible premiere. He had decent content in episode 2, but he gets voted out in episode 3. And while he does get positive content here and there on Edge of Extinction, I mean, who really would have thought he would have come back to the game in the finale and win the game from that point on? I mean, the two frontrunners for most of the season were Rick, who had a similar style of editing to that of a Ben, and Lauren, who had a similar style of editing to your typical female winner edit. But it seems like this season was built to build Rick up as the winner, only to have Chris be the one to take him down and be the winner because of that. Again, this isn't a common style of editing for Survivor, and Chris's win was completely unexpected. Alright, now for the final winner we're going to be talking about, and that is Tommy, who, I mean, gets your typical winners at it. I mean, which was weird to see. Nowadays, I mean, he did have some inconsistencies, like his disconnection to the season's theme of IOI and women empowerment, and also how he got a relatively quiet edit for a male winner. But he had the personal content with him talking about him being a teacher and also about proposing to his girlfriend. He had the personal connections with Janet and Lauren. He got strategic credit for a good chunk of the season. The only time I didn't think of him as a frontrunner was when Boston Rob and Sandra made a bet about a woman winning the season, but at the end of the day, they were kind of unreliable commentators throughout the entire season anyway. So by the time of the merge, I really had no doubt Tommy was winning the game. His win was pretty obvious. There we go. That's every winner in the history of Survivor and their respective winner edits. Obviously, there's no definitive winner edit. While there are tropes that they typically follow, you can't really count on them for every season, with seasons like Edge of Extinction and Cagayan being major examples of that. And I do feel like we're in an age of Survivor where production knows what they're doing with the edit, where they are editing in a way to where people are going to be surprised by the outcome, or they want people to be surprised by the outcome. They don't want a very blatant winner edit. And I do think, even though like Tommy got a blatant winner edit, I do think that's because of a miscalculation on their part. But at the end of the day, Survivor still does strive to make their winners likable, or at least making the viewer satisfied with the conclusion of the season. And I think that portion of the idea of the winner edit will never really go away. So that's the video. Now, I would like to do a lot more talking about Edgic in the future. I do have some future ideas that I might do down the road, like talking about the Journey edit, or maybe the Merge Boot edit. That will be for down the road. But for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.